Namaste and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology, debunking mythology. Sattology means science of truth, the study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which means science or study of fake lie or imagination. Sattology builds your identity, whereas mythology destroys your identity. Now, there are many things that we research and we try to see on the news items, particularly, and you don't see the actual facts. But here we discuss things which are of importance to everyone, including us, in the current affairs also. Maybe this incident, what happened recently in Europe, is going to go in the records of history for being the most violent new happenings in Europe. So let us welcome my friend Carpentier. Welcome, Com.
Namaskar. Greetings to all.
Namaskar, namaskar. So France riots, people were questioning that, and I was waiting for you to come back. You were busy. And according to you, what were the main reasons for these riots? Because France preaches a lot of democracy to India. When Prime Minister Modi was in France, the media was all against it. 90% of the media was opposing why Prime Minister Modi is being given uh, so much of importance in France. But the leadership was thinking in a different direction. Why do you think this was there in France?
You mean the riots?
The riots, yes.
Yeah, well, this has been a long-standing problem. There were major riots back in 2005, and therefore there has been a state of continuous or at least sporadic tension. The tension is always there because the tension is between communities which really do not share any common values or interests. And certain minorities, particularly minorities of North African origin and of Muslim faith, have become in large part very radicalized. So there is an element of jihad, of a fight against the infidels who are oppressing them, supposedly. And on the other hand, there is also a very strong criminal element, which has penetrated the relatively disadvantaged immigrant communities that live in certain areas, certain suburbs, which have in some way become ghettos, where the police are certainly not welcome and where they generally don't dare to go because they are greeted with all sorts of brickbats and insults and even fireworks, and in some cases, actual live fire. So these communities, these neighborhoods have become quite unsafe for outsiders, and they have become very dependent on illicit trade, drug trafficking, and that is itself has created a gangland atmosphere reminiscent of what happens in certain American cities. Naturally, South America is famous for gangs, but so are the United States. And you just have to think of West Los Angeles and almost every big city in the US. So we have the same thing happening in France with trafficking, and a lot of people participate in these drug transactions because even young kids, less than 14 years old, are used as watchers and spies to warn whenever any police or any interference is to be expected. So, and they get a lot of money for that. So naturally, it's becoming more attractive to become part of one of those gangs. And if you look at the riots, there was a lot of sheer destruction for the sake of destruction, but there was also, of course, a lot of plunder, a lot of stealing of everything from household items to cars and bicycles, motorcycles, you name it. Now, it's also interesting to know that a lot of the areas that were the most heavily devastated were actually middle-class areas where most of those rioters, who are mostly, who are generally below 17, 18, there are a few leaders who are older, but most of the actual rioters are very young. And they didn't do it in their own areas for obvious reasons. They went and wrought havoc in some more upscale area where not many immigrants live, because that's where they could essentially satisfy their urge for mayhem and also for plunder without damaging their own neighborhoods, and also in that way escaping the control of their parents. And what's even more interesting, the control of the parents is very weak because the parents most of the time have no real authority on these kids. But what is even more interesting is that the internal regulation of these communities is increasingly provided by certain groups which are affiliated to the Muslim Brotherhood or to other religious organizations. And these groups act as a sort of a militia, which is keeping a low profile, but they have weapons. In fact, we know there are quite a lot of Kalashnikovs and other things. And when need arises, they can step in and say, enough nonsense now, go back to your home and stop the rioting. Why? Because one, they do not want to completely alienate the majority community, and they know that there could be so much resentment building up against immigrants in general that it could make their lives much more difficult. And insofar as they are beneficiaries of the drug trade, although some of those religious organizations have no connection with the drug trade, they are pursuing a more political agenda. They are basically acting in the long term in the view that there will be increasingly communities within France and within other European countries which will be Islamic and which will have their own laws, their own rules, and their own management. And that's already happening. Not only in France, it's happening in Germany, in Austria, in England, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Italy, in Spain, you name it. So, in Sweden. So essentially what those people are saying is that over the long term, we will gain a tremendous amount of autonomy and authority, and the West, or at least Europe, will definitely be partly colonized by us, partly or wholly. They may not look so far ahead, but they certainly believe that Sharia and other regulations will apply to people which have a sufficient Muslim percentage of population. And so for these people, rioting is not such a good idea. So they may give them a little leeway, but then they calm them down. And that shows that the state is no longer able to ensure security on its own. It must in some way cooperate and rely on those Muslim and also Muslim militias, and also on the control system that the drug economy has created, because the drug lords are also hostile to too much trouble, because that ends up paralyzing their lucrative transactions. So at some point, they step in and say, enough nonsense, just go back home and stop burning cars and throwing fireworks at the police and smashing storefronts, because in the end, that attracts a very heavy police presence, which is bad for our business. So, there is a simple here gangland logic in which I'm afraid the state and its police are becoming increasingly inoperative and are sometimes looking more like weaknesses. Yeah.
Yes, I'm there. I missed you a lot of things in the middle.
Yes, because there is something wrong with the connection. It keeps stopping sometimes, I'm afraid. So I also don't always see you continuously speaking. There are in the middle of sentences, there are certain little sort of stops or something. I don't know why.
Yeah, there is a gap. Yeah, there's a delay on your side somewhere. You can check.
Yeah. Okay. But that may be because of the international connection, I mean, there has been, I don't know what is the factor, but, there has been a lot of rain in Delhi, and some things have been affected. I don't know if that affects the electronic networks as well, but it could be.
Could be. Anyway, so coming to the, I heard the reasons, like how there are small pockets of religious and extremely violent young people, 17. So do you think you connect this to anyway the shooting of the young boy in France?
That was a provocative factor. Clearly, it's a bit like the killing of this man in America, or in Minneapolis, I think, which unleashed BLM. The same phenomenon. It's enough that one person dies in suspicious and probably very wrongful circumstances for an entire section of the population to rise up and to wreak havoc. So that shows the tension that exists and which only ask for a particular reason to explode. And in the case of France, obviously, this kid who was 17 years old and who was driving a yellow Mercedes, apparently he had already had something like 15 recorded brushes with the police. So at an age of 17, that's a lot. And obviously, that doesn't excuse his shooting, but there was something wrong with him. And he was one of those who, take pleasure in challenging the police, in insulting them, and in telling them there is nothing you can do against me, because when the police told him to stop, he actually took off. And that's when the policeman shot, from what we have seen on the cameras. So the police should obviously not have shot somebody who was not armed and who, but then again, as I was telling somebody else on one of the shows I did recently, there are probably 1 million people in France who drive without a license. And most of them come from the immigrant community. So these people, by definition, do not want to be checked by the police. If the police tells them to stop, they often drive off because they know that otherwise they will be given more severe. Because if they let it happen, the indigenous citizens who have to comply, an immigrant community practically a free hand. I'm sorry. I see a little notice saying your internet connection is unstable. So that's probably the reason why we are having these problems. But that may be a general issue with the area right now. I don't know. Anyway, there is another interesting thing to be said in connection with those riots. It is that there was a particular situation. Anyway, that thing distracted me when he told me that the connection is unstable, so I'll have to remember what I meant to say. But it had to do with the general breakdown of law and order, which is very characteristic of what's happening in the West now, both in the US, as you know very well, where you live, as well as in Europe.
One thing really strikes me: the Prime Minister's visit and the Bastille Day parade of India happened right after these incidents, and there was no, it looked like a very normal Bastille Day celebrations. And I like to congratulate you and everyone in France who is watching on the Bastille Day event. Beautiful event, beautiful parade. And I really like the way Indian troops were welcomed over there. But I was going through the media reports, French media reports during that time when Prime Minister was visiting. Like, there was a significant opposition to Prime Minister Modi's visit in the France. And I would say that 80% or 90% of the media was opposing it. But there were 10-20% of media which was really supporting it also. So why do you think that kind of reaction was there in the media?
You see, the media has been badgering India in most of the West for the last 10 years or 9 years, since practically the Narendra Modi government came to power, because the leitmotiv is that India's democracy is slipping. It is an authoritarian state. There is no protection for minorities. They call it Hindu majoritarianism, which means that only Hindus get to make decisions, and Muslims and Christians are regarded as second-class citizens or intruders. And this is what is being told to people day in and day out. And even after Prime Minister Modi left, there were some more articles saying that, everything that is being used to promote this thesis and to support it, including the fact that Rahul Gandhi was removed from parliament, including the fact that, the opposition is becoming weaker and weaker, which is supposed to be because of the authoritarian actions of the government. This is all a campaign which is being driven from abroad, but with a lot of support from certain people in India, as we know, and also Indians abroad, particularly academics. And therefore, people have very few opportunities to learn, to hear a different story. It's I mean, the fact is that India is now seen as a state which is gradually turning authoritarian, a bit like China or Russia. And the fact that India has refused to join the West in its campaign to defeat Russia has made people even more convinced that India is not on their side and that India is not embracing freedom, democracy, and human rights, which is, of course, a very convenient way for the West to feel superior and to claim that they have the moral high ground, which is, of course, something that the West is very adamant about, that even if they have lost a lot of their power and their colonies, they still have the moral high ground, and they have to teach real values to other people, what we call European values and what Americans call American values of freedom, democracy, and human rights. All that stuff which is being peddled around. And the latest tragedy in Manipur has comforted a lot of people in this opinion, that, Manipur erupted because the central government was supporting the Hindus against the Christians. And that attracted the support of all the Christians in the West, who are generally very quiet about what happens in the Middle East, for example, or in Pakistan to Christians. But whenever there is something involving Christians in India, then they are up in arms saying, we must stop this Hindu fundamentalist government which is oppressing Christians. I mean, it's very unfortunate, but that's the way it is. It's both in America and in Europe, and there are only a few, what you might call right of center, or even some people call them far right, who to support India to an extent, because some of them are also Christian, very supportive of Christianity, so they feel that India cannot be allowed to get away with what they consider to be oppression of Christians. And the fact is that maybe the Indian missions abroad are not proactive enough to fight that propaganda. They should make perhaps more active interventions to show that there is a different side to this picture, and that not everything that is being repeated in the mainstream news is accurate and right. But I guess India has taken the position that, we are not going to answer all this. This is our internal business. They have no reason to meddle in it, so we are not even going to honor them with a response. But of course, that's not necessarily the best solution, because that means the whole conviction that people have builds up, and more people are convinced that India is not to be, trusted, and etc., etc. So you understand that because you live in the West, so you know what I'm referring to.
No, Indian missions, you correctly said, Indian missions are just reactive, sitting there and waiting for a reply. Looks like the old bureaucratic setup in the West. Even in the USA also, when the Indian citizens are fighting, Indian origin people, not even citizens, Indian origin Americans are fighting for their rights against the California bill, Indian missions are very quietly watching. They don't even respond. And the problem is like when the problem becomes acute, and most of the political visits of Narendra Modi are done from India. They're not done from the US. And the Indian citizens actively participate in that in the US and Europe and other places. The Indian missions are definitely very less active to fight against a mispropaganda, which affects Indian origin people actually. Coming to the state of religion in the West, I mean, I can tell you one thing about the United States, that it is a Christian, they want to make it a Christian country, Christian fundamentalist country, USA, especially the Republican Party. The main opposition which the Vivek Ramaswamy is getting in the Republican Party is from the Christian groups. The main reason is he's not a Christian. How can he lead USA? So that faulty thing has come in. They don't see that the Constitution of the United States is neutral, gives equal rights to and freedom to everyone to practice their own religion. The Manipur riots got bad publicity, and I will be honest with the audience, I don't know the full details, and I do not know, and I do not want to know also, because the reason is the Matai community was a Hindu community which is being harassed in Manipur. And this is what, as per my information, says they've been harassed because the churches were not able to convert them, and they rose against those kind of conversion activities. Now, the riots were mostly political in nature. The people got weapons from abroad to fight against the local Meitei people. This is what I have seen the report. I may be totally wrong. So the entire Western accusation on the Christian rights being hurt in Manipur is totally false. In fact, the most of the Bengal violence also, people have not spoken about Bengal violence, which was done by the state of one of the states, which is a left, which is a pro-Islamic state government, and the violence against Hindus was not even spoken in those riots. But in any way, Europe, any country of Europe or USA has no right to peddle in India's internal affairs. That's what India says. And French riots also, Indians did not peddle into internal affairs of France. So I think Europeans have to now start actually practicing what they preach. They have not been preaching, they have not been practicing, but preaching a lot to the world. Last question for today, and that's why I said it's going to be an explosive interview. So, for you, is that why do the arms like the Scorpion submarine deal, the French Rafale deal, did not happen during the Prime Minister's visit to France?
You may have to repeat your question because, again, we had these problems with the connection. So there were a couple of seconds which were not audible. So
Yes,
what did you say? It was not the...
So why did the Scorpion and the Rafale deal did not get signed during the Prime Minister's visit to France?
But I'm told they are going ahead, and I believe everybody is very positive on both sides that it is happening. So, and given that the Rafale deal is already more than halfway through, I doubt very much that it would stop now. There is very little reason to think so. There is an interesting factor that France is openly competing with the US with regard to providing India with certain technologies, particularly for jet engines, for planes, for fighter planes. And clearly, the US has made a certain proposal to India, but France is trying to best that proposal and offer 100% technology transfer. Whether that will actually happen or not, I don't know. But the amount of technology transfer is certainly higher than what the Americans offered. And therefore, India will have to make a decision. And on one hand, you have the strategic consideration, which is that America's goodwill is, of course, important, and you don't want to upset them if you can avoid it. But on the other hand, France is also a very convenient partner and even an ally because of the fact that there are no conflicting interests on borders or any other issue. There is no colonial backlog, so legacy issues. So in a way, it's a good thing if India can manage both the US and France and make both countries happy. I think the Scorpion deal is also regarded as a done deal. I can't go into the technical details as to why certain things were not signed, but I assume that the signature is a formality, and from what I hear, everything is moving forward.
So one of the things is like India is using American engines for MK2, Tejas MK2, and India is using French engines for AMCA. So because the French engines are coming with a higher power than the American engines. And American technologies always comes with a lot of invisible catches. And so Indians are going to iron out on piece of paper. And there is a history of American politicians to go back on the words, what they have done in Minsk against the Minsk agreements and other agreements. And the France has always followed through, at least with India. I won't say that what they have done with Africa is different, but at least with India, they have followed through. And also India has been using French planes, Rafales and Mirages, which have been very, very helpful to Indian forces. In fact, the Balakot strike was done by the Mirage 2000s of India. So, and the India's planes also, Tejas is based on Rafale planes, Mirages, something that looks like Mirage actually, Delta Wing. So, do you think...
Rafale is like a second generation Mirage,
Yeah, continuation. So, do you think that the French will break from the American influence, or because they have always stood against the British hegemony, they've always stood against and gone independent against even the American whatever they call it, foreign policy diktats. So do you think that France can stand up to their Western lobby? Because their West is UK and US.
Well, that will have to be seen. I think definitely there is mutual respect at the official level between India and France very much needs India's business because its own defense industry is not sustainable without big clients, and particularly with India, because there are no such big clients anywhere else. The Chinese are in some ways off limits, and therefore the French have every interest in furthering their relationship with India, even if the media and a certain liberal establishment is generally bad-mouthing India. But at the political level and at the big business level, definitely the interest in cooperation with India is very strong. And also, let's face it, France is part of NATO. It has to follow the US lead. And this has become worse now because of the Ukraine war, where basically the Americans have marshaled all Europeans into saying, now you're just going to do what we tell you. There is no question of showing any kind of autonomy. So every country has had to toe the line, and the French have been no exception, even though they have made some noises that, we don't quite agree, but in the end, they have done exactly what the Americans want. And that's what they will continue to do. So the question is, will the Americans give enough rope to France to fulfill certain strategic commitments? I think that there are some big projects between India and France for satellites, for common satellites. And the fact is that in the Indian Ocean, France can be a force multiplier for India because it has a big interest in the Indian Ocean, and it needs India to defend its interest, which means essentially its overseas territories, from certain very greedy competitors, which are either local players or, of course, China, and even the US, which wouldn't mind, or Australia, which wouldn't mind, taking advantage of France by depriving France of some of its assets, just as they have kicked them out of the Australian, submarine deal. So that is the reason why France needs India, and India can certainly benefit from French cooperation. Beyond that, we will see how many of these agreements will be fully executed.
Thank you so much, Komakapatia, because I think many things are going slow in the show because of the internet connection. So, but for the viewers to know that the France-India relationships is strong, but at the same time, I think the France lecturing habits have to stop, just like the American lecturing habits have to stop. Human rights in USA are big problem, at least for the minority religious communities, because of the content they produce. And so France has originated most of the philosophies of the West. France is a place capitalism came out, socialism came out, the classical communism also came out from France. So do you think that all these French philosophers created like monsters, or it gave seeds to the monsters? They became monsters in other countries. And now everything is hitting back. It's like the empire hits back. Do you think the French society is going to a little bit introspect and see how they can stop the spread of these dangerous ideologies which they created actually in the first place?
I think this is happening through the rise of certain parties, which are becoming more and more powerful. And those parties generally have a nationalistic outlook. But they are also aware that France needs to recover its independence and needs to practice a policy of good relations and good neighborliness, but also cooperation with all and trying to resist hegemony from other powers. This was in large part the policy that General de Gaulle preached and tried to apply, very often going against the interest of the British and the Americans, which is also what got him in trouble and forced him to leave power prematurely. But I think France has a legacy of what you might call a certain amount of non-alignment. And that is what hopefully can lead to a change in the political ideology in France and to a new government ruled by different ideas. So that is something which is happening all over Europe. But France is particularly important in this field because it has a capability to lead. If you see what happened in Italy, where the current government has taken different positions on many issues, despite the fact that Italy is even more dependent on the United States than France. And I think France will follow the Italian lead and will also have a government that will try to enforce, essentially protect the national interest and diversify its foreign relations and build strong connections with other countries than the Western hegemon. So that is what we have to hope. And, since you said this would be explosive, I would say that the West has really not much left now, except the control of financial institutions, most of them, and the ability to show itself as a leader in the field of human rights and what they call human values. And this is a smokescreen. Their societies are also highly corrupt, and they are not able to give a good example. And if you look at, for example, the current LGBTQX craze, this is a complete racket and a ripoff. It's only meant to sort of try to control other societies by saying, you are not doing the right thing. You need to protect those people and give them due credit and honor them. So you need to hold, LGBT marches and gay prides and this and that and the gay pride month. And you need to put a lot of them into your institutions. And this is basically a way, number one, to overturn traditional society mores and cultures and to say, no, we are bringing you something new. And if you don't belong to that, then you are backward, you are fascist, and you are not acceptable in polite society. And if you can see through it, you realize that it's a very devious plot and it should be defeated. Even in America, a big part of the country is fighting it. But these people are very powerful. They have a lot of money, and they are using this to try to extend or at least maintain their power.
No, I can tell you the human rights is such a big bogey. There used to be a secretary before, Elliot Adams, who in the name of, he was, I think, a deputy secretary for human rights and human relations or something like that. And he was the one who was charged for murders in Nicaragua in the name of human rights, where the reports are out, where he actually led missions arming opposition to create riots in Nicaragua. So civilians were killed, thousands of civilians. So human rights is just a smoke screen for terror operations, and then generally they lost values, because the human rights, the country where the human rights are most safe today as a world is India, where everyone can speak. And I think the different religious communities of India, especially minority ones, they should note that they're the safest in India because of Indian laws. In fact, Indian laws go against the majority of the India. So
before yesterday, we gave a lunch. When I say we, I mean the India Foundation gave a lunch for Mohammed Abdul Raza. I think it's Abdul Raza. Anyway, Sheikh Mohammed Al
Isa
and Mohammed Abdul Karim Al Isa, who is the president of the World Muslim League and who came on behalf of the King of Saudi Arabia to preach to Indian Muslims that they should love and respect the constitution, accept that there is a Hindu majority, which is therefore the predominant influence, which they should not combat, but rather welcome, and that their duty is to serve the country, serve the constitution, and keep their religion private for themselves in their private lives. And that any action for religious conversion or religious extremist propaganda is to be completely banned and is un-Islamic. So he said that in his in his predication at the Jama Masjid in Delhi. He went to Akshardham temple to meet the head priest there. So you see, this shows a message that Saudi Arabia is now officially giving.
It's a very welcome step, and I really give very, very high respect for such kind of individuals. And Saudi Arabia is changing also. Saudi Arabia is now opening temples, legalizing yoga, and I think the countries world over should see that. And as soon as Saudi Arabia is changing, suddenly you see Islamophobia has disappeared. It's completely disappeared everywhere. because it was a campaign in the first place in any way. But the new campaign has come in the West, which is LGBTQ plus. So that's a new plus. And LGBTQ plus, Q refers to canon, or I do not know the full
The
form.
choir, it's referred to choirs, what they call choirs. And there are now in universities in America choir studies, whatever that means. It's absolute rubbish. And it's like, sort of trans studies. I mean, and then you go to ask children if they want to change their sex, and you perform operations without even telling the parents. And then, of course, a lot of people make money on that. And that's what is called, the new normal and the new faith. I mean, it's replacing religion, basically.
I mean, traditional Christian values, though, they say that is being replaced. But anyway, I have to be very particular with the pronouns now in the US, because if I want to communicate with people, then I have to make sure
right.
I use the word they, not he or she, because somebody said I'm they. So I said they. Okay, English word they now has a different meaning now. So
yes.
So it's a totally different world right now for me also to learn. And in my books also, in the new book I'm writing, I have made it singular, because now I have to make it one. One has to say, one has to do, one has to say, because people have to get used to it. Earlier I used to say he or she. So it's affecting writers too.
Whenever I hear people saying they, I am reminded of the gospel where Jesus says, there is a man coming up to him who is sick and he's possessed by the devil. And then Christ says, what is your name? And he says, we are legion. And he says, I command you, devils, to get out of this man's body. And that's what's happening with those people who are they. They are possessed by innumerable devils. That's why they are plural.
I mean, somewhere, yeah, somewhere. I mean, yeah, but
now you really get in trouble now.
As a disclaimer, I will say that is Combs' personal views from India. And I have to follow what the laws say here. And generally in California, it's very particular. And in fact, the most of the district attorneys in California, and one of my best ones locally in San Diego, and I have to support them because they are the ones who are actually behind this movement, which is done by the government. And so it's the California laws are in any way very pro, is the one step ahead of rest of the Union of States of USA. Now, coming back to the one native rights thing, and which I really support the governor of California for, which is on the native rights. He has done a lot of work for native rights, and also reparation to every single African American in the world. That is, he's also doing that. I wish they do the reparations. The Britain can learn and send some money to India more. They're already accusing on Chandrayaan. So
they said that India is not being grateful because they apparently gave them 3 billion or something like that in the last several years. So they say they should at least sing God Save the Queen when they launched Chandrayaan. The British have a very peculiar view of their role in the world. They really think they benefited India a great deal. They helped India come out of barbarity.
No, by the way, Britain, if they're listening, anyone from Britain is listening, India needs $45 trillion back from you, number one. And number two, India is, like in terms of space mission, since 2015, I think 2014 or 15, India has refused to take British aid. And in fact, most of the Indian states can give aid to the British society for their poverty reduction programs. Especially, I think India should fund them to learn Hindi, because they speak Hindi words in any way. They speak roti, they have too many Hindi words, curry also they use, and all kinds of, and India has to withdraw some problematic British words like democracy and other things. They have to withdraw. So thank you so much, Combe.
Democracy is Greek. Anyway, right.
Thank you, Combe Carpentier. I think this show has been enough explosive for everyone to listen to. And for people, you can
right.
like, share, subscribe, and let us know if you enjoy.
Sometimes it's good to make.
You're saying something. What are you saying?
No, I was saying that sometimes it's good to vent your own feelings and let people get a different perspective, and not think that everybody thinks the same way.
Exactly. Yeah. With that, real Sattology is happening today on the show, on current affairs. Thank you and namaste.
Namaste. Bye.